free to ask any questions during the webinar using the chat box in your webinar panel. We will save time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions you have. Also, this session is being recorded and will be sent to you following the presentation, so please feel free to share this with others. All right, now let's get started. So this is part one of our webinar series, Staff Development Best Practices within the Tax Profession. Part one will cover the current data points around staff development and employee satisfaction. So once this foundation is established based upon the data, our future webinars will deep dive into the tactical action steps needed based upon these staff development trends. Today we are joined by Stephanie Gill-Martin and Adam Golden. They both have over a decade with Tax Search, helping companies build and maintain world-class tax departments. Over the years, Stephanie and Adam have established themselves as premier recruiters for top-tier tax talent in the U.S. Stephanie is originally from California, but calls Tulsa home now with her husband, 2 daughters, and 2 dogs. Adam, originally from Georgia, also lives in Tulsa with his wife, 2 daughters, and 1 son. Adam, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Shannon. I appreciate that. Today, Stephanie and I, we're going to really focus on some of the results from our recently published 2016 Career Satisfaction Survey. Hopefully, a lot of you have seen that. If you haven't, you can always reach out to Stephanie or myself, and we can make sure we get a copy of that to you. And we'll be talking about some themes and trends that we've been seeing that we could take away from this year's survey, and talk a little bit about things from 2 perspectives. So as we go through the webinar, we're going to be discussing topics both from the hiring authority's perspective, but also from the individual's perspective. I'm going to cover the things on the hiring authority side of the fence. Stephanie's going to cover things from the individual's perspective. And while we're splitting these things into 2, I want to make a point that we both understand that many of you attending could fall into both categories. You could certainly have people reporting to you, and the things we talk about from a hiring authority's perspective could resonate with you, but we also firmly believe that everybody can focus on some of these topics from their own individual careers as well. So while we are separating the 2 of them, they do kind of commingle with one another and go hand in hand. So as I mentioned at the end, we're going to open things up for questions, so feel free to ask questions from either perspective, whether it's from an individual's perspective or from a hiring authority's perspective. Stephanie and I will do our best to take on those questions and hopefully get you some answers on them. One of the 2 major components or actually there's 2 major components in our career satisfaction survey every year, and if you've seen these over the years, they should probably resonate with you. It's both trust and understanding. And before we get into the specifics of what the participants of the survey thought of understanding and trust, I wanted to take a second and just talk about how the 2 are really kind of intertwined together. At the firm here, we firmly believe that we are in the middle of the communication age where it's easier to communicate with people now in all the various forms that are out there than really any other time in our history. And in this age, we believe that trust is really the new currency. And our premise, that we operate off of is that, before you can initially build trust with someone, you first must attempt to try to understand them. So with that in mind, we're going to start our presentation talking about understanding, but I don't want you to think of understanding and trust as 2 separate topics. In fact, I believe you can actually make a strong argument that you really can't be understood until you trust someone. With the idea that the more you trust them, the more open you'll be with them, and the better they'll be able to understand you. So as you see the yin-yang on the screen there, I think it ideally represents trust and understanding. The more you attempt to understand someone, the more they will trust you. The more they trust you, the more likely they're going to be to open up to you, and the 2 kind of feed into one another. So from a hiring authority's perspective, understanding, let's talk a little bit about that. What does the survey tell us about understanding? Well, you can see on the screen 51% of respondents felt like their tax department did not take the time to understand their career goals and objectives. This is not a good stat, as you can imagine. It's over half of the people that that responded felt this way. I can also tell you from my perspective, and Stephanie will echo this, I'm sure, this is pretty consistent with what I hear in the market. When I'm talking to people about their main motivations for wanting to leave, it's rarely about work-life balance or about being underpaid. It consistently is about not feeling like their career goals and objectives are being met. I talk to many hiring authorities, and when I talk to them, sometimes they want to put their head in the sand on this issue, and I hear claims that either the expectations of staff are unrealistic, or you can't be talking about me, I'm already doing a good enough job in this area. And the main point I want to make here from a hiring authority impact is this stat is very consistent. It's been very consistent for the last 3 years we've been doing this survey. This is an issue that's not going away, and even if you feel like you're doing a good job, you probably should continue to do that and even do a little bit more if you feel like you haven't had the time to do some of these things. Understanding and trust, as we'll talk about here in a minute, are the fundamentals to keeping staff retention, and in this highly competitive market we're in right now, the more time you can spend in these areas, the better. 85% of the people that we spoke to, or not spoke to, that responded to the survey, felt that an employee, when their employer doesn't understand their career goals, this will have an impact on their relationship with their employer, and not in the positive way, as you can imagine. So it's critical that on the understanding side of the fence, employers make the time, make the effort, try to do their best to understand their career goals and aspirations. And then we'll talk about fear here in just a minute, but I also want to make the point that you can't approach understanding from an aspect of fearing what you're going to hear, and approaching it with fear in mind. And fear is a separate topic we'll talk about here in just a minute. Stephanie, what are some of the main takeaways on the understanding side of the fence from an individual's perspective?
Yeah, so very similar. They really go hand in hand from a hiring authority's perspective. But, I just want to go back and mention that 85% again. As most of you are listening, you're in the situation where you are an individual and you do report to someone. And 85% of people feel that their employer does not understand their career goals, and that is going to affect how they feel about their job and how they feel about their boss and their company. That, to me, is a staggering number, and one that, as Adam mentioned, it's been going on a long time. We see it every day, but when you really see that percentage and think about how big that is, something has to change. That being said, we have to be careful that as individuals, we are being proactive, and we're not sitting back and just waiting for things to happen. So it's really critical that if someone has that feeling, that you be proactive and be a willing participant in communicating your needs and wants to your employer, and not just be waiting for them to come to you. You have to take charge and manage your career. Someone else cannot do that for you. They're all way too busy. So it takes a lot of time to do that, and it's easy to sweep that under the rug and go about your daily business, but it's got to be something that you put into your plan to really focus on, because no one else will but you. And then once you communicate your needs and wants and you start to get that understanding, the communication going forward will be much easier. And again, like Adam said, trust and understanding, once you kind of build both of those, everything will get better. You'll feel much more appreciated. You'll feel like your employer has your best interest at heart. So that's just kind of a brief, little summary of what an individual has to do just initially to start that understanding. Adam, I think you're going to talk about trust next, as far as how that affects the hiring authority.
Yes, that's exactly right. As we mentioned, trust and understanding go hand in hand. And while some of the numbers are a little bit better, we still have issues with trust in our respondents. Of the respondents who actually answered yes to the first question. So the first question is, do you feel like your company understands you? If they answered yes, then we ask them a follow-up question, and it's basically, do you trust that your hiring, your boss or your company or your employer is committed to helping you achieve those goals? And you can see we still have over a quarter of the people that answered, yes to the first question, then told us that they do not feel like their company, they do not trust that their company has their best interest at heart and committed to helping them achieve their goals. Again, I could see the argument being made that, if I don't trust someone, can I really understand them, and vice versa? But at the end of the day, if you're making the time to understand the person and you're following through, and consistency is really what I believe to being the key to building trust. If you're doing those things, then the trust is something that's going to grow over time. And this is one of those things, and I know Stephanie's going to talk about it on the individual side of the fence as well, that building trust doesn't happen overnight. We are all in an instant gratification society. I think everybody wants things faster and to do more sooner. But the issue of trust is not something that you're going to fix overnight. And that's where I keep talking about consistency being the key to building trust. And this is the hard part, because it's about follow through. It's about if you tell someone you're going to do something to help them, you end up doing it. You don't let other things that could be more pressing and more important, the day-to-day stuff, kind of come in and take over, especially when it comes to staff development areas, in the areas where your staff may want to develop, but maybe it doesn't completely align with what you need in your department. And that's important. We'll talk a little bit about that again in the fear section. But the trust element is really built around consistency. If you're consistent with what you're doing, you're following up on a consistent basis, more and more trust is going to be built over time, and then again, your staff are going to open up to you more, and you'll have a better understanding of their situation because the trust is being built. We're talking about trust again from the hiring authority's perspective, but as I mentioned, it's really individual with each person, isn't it, Stephanie?
It is, and as I said earlier, it's really just a mirroring, almost exactly the same thing. I mean, as a hiring authority, you have to be patient. You have to be consistent. It's the same way from an individual standpoint. You can't sit back and expect your employer to do that and you not do the same thing. And as Adam said, in our world today, we all want things right now. And with any relationship, that trust and understanding take time. And so you have to be patient. You have to work at it. And if you do that, it will happen. You have to be consistent and really follow through. If you say you're going to get something done, you need to get it done. And if you're going to expect that out of your employer, you have to expect that out of yourself. If you don't do that, how can your employer really build that trust in you? So follow through, being consistent with everything that you're saying, being patient is very, very important. The other thing is, be careful and don't let the cynic in you develop and impede on your ability to trust your employer. Maybe you've had bad situations that have happened to you in the past. A previous employer or a previous boss, it put a bad taste in your mouth. Well, let it go. Have an open mind with your new employer or your current employer and your boss. Don't let that creep in. If something is not going your way or the follow-through is not there by your employer, speak up. Don't wait. Don't just say, oh, this always happens to me. I've been through this before. You got to be patient. You got to take control. Don't wait for it to happen. And you know, if it doesn't feel like your employer is putting in the time, you still do it. You do it without fail. So that if something happens and you do end up where it doesn't work out at that employer, you can sleep at night knowing you gave it 100%. So be committed to making it happen regardless. And so that's just a few tips on the individual side. We're going to talk about mentoring next. Adam's going to get into the hiring authority side. This is such an important area for everybody, whether you're hiring authority or an individual. So this is really, really key. Adam?
Yeah, I tell my clients all the time, the mentoring aspect of this, trust and understanding are kind of two of the pillars. Mentoring is the third pillar, and I would even argue the glue that kind of holds all of this together. If you understand the person and you want to develop trust, and we were talking about follow through, it's the mentoring is where the follow through happens. This is the action steps that actually help the person achieve what they're wanting to achieve. It will build more trust and things like that. And you can see the stat on the screen that says of the respondents who lacked confidence in leadership, 90% also stated that they do not feel like they received the appropriate amount of mentoring and support. And it's true, everything will fall apart without the mentoring. Mentoring builds loyalty. I have candidates, I mean, you know, those of you who know me, you know my job is to talk on the phone all day, every day to candidates for our clients to try to recruit for them. And I can tell you unequivocally, I have candidates that I've talked to over the years that will stay, you know, underpaid or won't even listen to new opportunities because they're committed to working with someone that they view as their mentor. And when I'm recruiting them, it's a red flag for me on a candidate on if they would actually leave their company when I ask them who their mentor is and they talk to me, they tell me it's their boss or things like that. So I mean, mentoring is, you know, the trust and understanding can be somewhat conceptual, and the next webinar will give you guys some tangible things you can do to help, you know, implement some processes on the understanding side of the fence and whatnot. But it's the mentoring that's going to build the trust and that's going to allow you to do the things where you'll build more trust. I mentioned fear earlier. We're going to talk about fear in the next section, but I'll mention it again. You know, you cannot mentor with fear. And you could be thinking, well, what's he talking about with mentoring with fear? And, you know, we'll have Stephanie cover mentoring from an individual perspective, and then we're going to dive into fear in more detail. So, you know, Stephanie, one question I have for you, I mean, while hiring authorities have responsibility for mentoring, it's also equally important for the individual to take ownership over it, right?
Well, absolutely. It's just like we talked about as far as taking ownership and control over your career. Mentoring is, if not at the very top of the list, it's right after that. So everyone needs a mentor, right? I mean, everyone, professionally, personally, we all need mentors. We need people we can go to who we can trust, who understand us, and we can ask their advice. So, you know, having a mentor is one of the absolute best things you can do for your career. It has to be a priority for you. Again, just like these other things, it cannot be swept under the rug because you're too busy to seek out a mentor. You must have one. We recommend you have a mentor at work. It might be someone in the tax department. It might be someone outside of the tax department. But make sure they understand you, they know you, they can help you with your career goals. Also have a mentor outside of work. Those folks can be, you know, completely unbiased about what's going on in your day-to-day work life and great to bounce ideas off. So, you know, it's important to seek those out and make that a priority and not wait. The company will not come to you in most cases and say, hey, we have this great mentor for you. Some companies have, you know, defined mentoring programs, development programs that they have set up, but those are few and far between. So again, you need to really seek those out. Communicate your needs to your mentor. You know, make sure you're clear, you're concise, they know what you want, They know what you need, you know, and don't wait for them to ask you. You need to communicate that to them. Lastly, having a good mentor to model after gives you someone, or gives you the experience and um, the the kind of platform in being a good mentor to someone else, which is just one of the best ways you can give back as you go through your career, is to mentor and develop the people underneath you. So having someone that you can play off of, that has been great to you throughout your career, just sets you up to be a great mentor for someone else. So the last section we're going to talk about is fears. Adam's mentioned a couple of times, and it's not scary, I promise, but it is something that stands in our way of kind of getting what we want. And so Adam, he's going to touch on the hiring authority fear side, and then I'll follow back up on the individual side.
Sure, and if any of you guys have heard me at any TEI events or whatnot, understanding and trust and mentoring are things that we talk about quite a bit. We decided to add fear into this webinar, and it's not something that we've really kind of talked about before. But and before I get into some of the direct things on hiring from a hiring authority's perspective, I hear a lot of things from both staff and from people who are managing staff about I'm nervous about talking to my boss because of this, or I'm nervous about talking to my giving direct feedback to my people about that. And it occurred to us that fear is a natural byproduct of when change is happening, and at its core, development and growth, it's change. So I think it's important as you're, if you haven't been having regular conversations with your staff, or you're trying to implement something like this so that you can increase retention and whatnot, to recognize that having some apprehension, it's normal to have a little bit of fear. It's going to be normal if you're having some of these discussions for the first time, to expect that your staff may look at you a little bit cross-eyed and wonder well, what's his agenda, what's he up to, or and having some of the fear of the unknown is normal. So, from a hiring authority's perspective specifically, fear can come up in a couple of different ways. Being afraid to have the honest conversations with your employees about what they want, because this could mean you find out that your staff isn't happy and you're nervous about turnover. That's a big one. The staff could realize that you cannot meet their needs, and your staff, he or she, isn't a fit for the organization long more, and you're kind of opening that Pandora's box, so to speak. Or you could realize you can't meet their needs, right? And it's kind of the same concept. You could also realize that they want to move up. They're ambitious. They're career oriented, and this isn't public accounting, right? And most of corporations don't have the up or out kind of mentality that public accounting has. And how am I opening up the discussion about someone who who wants upper mobility, and we just can't offer it to them. Someone could decide they want to move out of tax. I hear it quite a bit that people have aspirations to do other things outside of tax, and again, the fear from a hiring authority's perspective about losing staff and whatnot. Having the time to do all of this is a big one. How am I going to find the time to mentor and spend all this time on development when we're already stretched so thin? There are no more peaks and valleys anymore. It's just peaks and peaks. And I mentioned fear with mentoring. What kind of, if I'm not in charge of the mentoring, if I let someone go find a mentor somewhere else through maybe our free mentoring tool on TaxTalent or something like that, what kind of advice are they getting? What kind of mentoring is this person going to get if I'm not involved in learning to let go of some of those things? So those are just a couple of examples of where fear shows up. And as I said before, you can't approach understanding with fear in mind. You can't be afraid of what you may hear. You can't be afraid of helping develop someone and what the ultimate repercussion of that may be, whether it's they move on to another company or they move out of tax or something like that. Because in the end, these things are going to happen on their own. If someone's not happy, they're going to end up surprising you. And the mentoring, what this will do is allow you to kind of manage some of these things and be in control of it. And the reality is these are legitimate fears, but as I mentioned, the cost of doing nothing is far worse than, the cost of, trying to understand your people and developing trust with them. So that's fear from the hiring authority's perspective. Stephanie, I know fear comes up on the individual side. What do you want to share in mind from that perspective?
Yeah, so, we've all been there. We're all afraid to be honest sometimes. The unknown consequences are scary, and many times it will just absolutely cause someone to not be honest and let their fear hold them back, which, that doesn't do anybody any good. It doesn't do the employer any good. They don't know what that employee needs. It's not doing the individual any good because they're not going to get anywhere unless they communicate their needs. So it's just a vicious cycle. So again, fear can get in the way, not just on the employer side, like Adam said, but big time on the individual side. Some of the areas that we see that fear comes into play when you're trying to be honest with your employer is, first one, you may lose your job if you tell somebody you're unhappy. That is a true fear. Second, your boss knowing you want his or her job, that is probably even bigger. You really want to move into your boss's job. Well, you can't really say it like that. That would cause that person to really be concerned. 3, being told you don't have what it takes to make the next step. Determining how much work you will have to do to get to the next level. Sometimes that can be daunting, and you just don't want to hear it. Your boss won't listen to you. That's scary. And your company won't change. That's a big one. So, I think the thing that you have to realize, if you don't communicate, the negative assumptions that will come into your mind from the fear, it won't do you any good. So it's really, really critical to communicate your thoughts. And most of the time, that fear can be alleviated by the delivery, which we can talk about in the next webinar, is how to really deliver what you're trying to say. If you build trust and you build understanding, the fear is much easier to overcome. If you feel your employer has your best interest at heart, that fear is probably going to almost completely go away. But if we circle back around, it really starts at the beginning with the trust and understanding that if you're honest with your employer, you really shouldn't have that fear. So that's pretty much it on the individual side. I think, Adam, you're going to cover what's on the next webinar, and we can answer any questions you all have.
Yeah, so in your chat box on your on the webinar dashboard, guys, certainly hit Stephanie and I with any questions you guys have on any of this, whether and if you have specific questions on maybe how to execute some of these things, we can certainly talk a little bit about that today. Our next webinar is going to focus on just that, from a hiring authority's perspective. How do you put some infrastructure in place so you can better understand your employees and build trust with them? And as an individual, what do we mean by taking control of your career? What are some tangible things, some tactical things you can do to take control over your career? And as Stephanie mentioned, how do you communicate some of these things in a manner so that it's going to be well received and some of that? So we're going to take some of these concepts that we talked about today on the next webinar, and we'll then talk about how do we execute them and how do we put them into practice, and what are some things we can do on that side of the fence. We hope to have some special guests with us that have either had some successes in these areas, or even some people that have gone through the trials and tribulations and have been struggling themselves and can talk to you a little bit about maybe what they've gone through. So we're real excited about starting this webinar series. We really hope that you guys will get some value out of this, and that we can start giving you guys some things that will help you from a retention standpoint, so that you don't have to always go out there and be reactive to the market. You could be proactive to what's happening in your departments, and if you're going to have turnover, you can manage it and not get surprised by these things. And ultimately, that's going to be what builds, the credibility with management and the faith in the CFO or whoever you report to, or your VP of tax or whatnot, that you've got your fingers on the pulse of what's going on from a personnel perspective in your department. So that's what the next webinar is going to be about. Shannon, do we have any questions coming in that Stephanie and I can address?
Yes, definitely. So the first question we have from the audience is, if my current employer is not in alignment with my goals, how can I protect myself from being fired when I'm having an honest conversation with them?
I can take that one.
Okay.
So, first of all, you want to make sure that you're not making any assumptions that the company is not in alignment with your goals. If you haven't had an honest communication with them. So that's first of all, get that fear, get the assumption out of your head. It would be extremely rare for you to be fired from having an open conversation about your goals with your employer, unless for some reason the conversation got very ugly and something terrible happened. But just having an open and honest communication with them should not put you in danger of being fired. If you've had the communication with them, and so you know that they are not going to work with you to help you achieve your goals, there's probably not much of a need to continue on that path. If you feel like you've done everything you can to talk to them about it, it's probably time to transition and start looking for something else. If you need to have the communication, the conversation, and lay out exactly what you want to them honestly, one of the techniques that we suggest in a situation like this, and we will kind of dive into this a little bit more in our next webinar, is the pull, push, pull technique. And that goes back to the delivery of what you're talking about that I mentioned. For example, you would go in and say, I really enjoy my job, I love this company, I love the environment, I want to stay a long time. That would be the pull part of the conversation. And then you would go into the push. However, I want to make sure I can put together a short-term, long-term plan in place to continue advancing my career, not just technically, but from a leadership standpoint. That's the push part. And then again, I'm happy. I want to stay here. I want to continue to advance my career with this company. So it's really important for me that we discuss this. And I know you're busy, but can we, put something on the calendar? That's the pull technique. So again, pull, push, pull. We'll go into that in more detail, but that's one way that you can deliver your thoughts and it come out a little bit better, so that some of that fear of something negative happening will go away.
The only other thing I might add to that is, and it just kind of occurred to me when you were talking, Stephanie, is there's also a reality that we are very much in a candidate-driven market right now. So the likelihood that you're going to go in and talk to your boss about, your career goals, and you realize it's not in alignment, and then your company's just going to out and out just decide to fire you out of the gate. I think that's a pretty unrealistic thing to expect to happen, just because finding good candidates and finding people who can do what you do for your company and already know your company, it's hard. Searches are taking longer to fill out there, and so right now I think candidates are in a bit of position of strength because there are a lot of jobs out there, and there's not as many good candidates. Now that can always switch, and we cycle back and forth between employer-driven markets and candidate-driven markets, but we are definitely in the middle of a candidate-driven market, which I think can empower the candidates a little bit more to feel comfortable going in and having these honest conversations without the repercussion that, oh, I'm going to get fired or restructured out or something like that, because these companies can't go that long without having their staff filled. We got anything else coming in, Shannon?
Yep, so the next question we have, I think this is more from the employer perspective. So when someone's goals are unrealistic and they don't have the skills or ability to reach that goal, how can I communicate this without pushing them away?
Yeah, I think, this is, I would say you'll use a similar technique to what Stephanie just talked about, is kind of the pull, push, pull technique on something like this. But I think it's, I think this is extremely common because at least I know a lot of the hiring authorities that I have spoken to have talked about how, the staff want to do, I want to be a director of tax in 3 years, and they've got 7 years of experience, or something like that. How things are unrealistic. And I think it's it's important to first off acknowledge that they have ambition and acknowledge that they want to advance their career, and embrace that, and don't come across as you're going to impede them. But you're going to, you're going to want to try to help them. So that the first pull, and if we're going to use the pull push pull that Stephanie talked about, the first pull is just that. It's acknowledging that, you think they have potential, you think that they can eventually do this, but there's some things that need to work on. And I would even pose the question back to them. Hey, you want to be ahead of tax, or you want to do such and such. What do you think your largest gaps are in order to help you get there, or in order for you to get there? And listen to what they have to say. What are they bringing to that meeting with them that, have they already identified 2 or 3 of the key things that they need in your mind, or are they focusing on things that are important but probably not the most important things? So, starting that dialogue with them, and maybe flipping that question back to them about, well, what do you think you need in order to get to that next step? And then, going through and having an honest conversation with them about, okay, yes, I think you need those things, but I would also say we probably need to work on this and this. And then, and we'll talk again more about this in the next webinar, but then putting the action plan in place, and beginning to execute that plan. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's what we need you to do in order to start to get there, and kind of put a timeline in place. If we tackle these things over this period of time, you can start to extrapolate out how long you think it's going to take someone to overcome a few of these things, and depending upon how close or far away they are, then you can get a sense for whether or not you're going to be able to meet that need down the road, or whether or not you've got someone in your department that ultimately may be outgrowing your company or outgrowing your department, and you are then working with them to come up with a transition plan. If they get to the end of the plan, and they are developing the things that you have said they need in order to get to that next step, and you can't accomplish that there. I've talked to hiring authorities before that have actually had people that they knew were leaving, 9 months, a year in advance, because the 2 of them were on the same page about what they want, and had put a transition plan in place, and were able to backfill the position and go out and recruit and have a little bit of overlap and some of those things. And that's what we talk about when it comes to managing the turnover and making sure you don't get surprised.
Okay, next question we have is, how do you manage the work-life balance requirements of a millennial? For example, planning does not start at 9 a.m. and end at 5 p.m. so you can make a workout at 6 p.m.
Yeah, that's I have a client right now that we are conducting a search for that has just that same issue. And I think part of it is an education on the hiring authority's perspective about sitting down and realistically, meeting with your staff about, what the needs of the company are, and what the needs of the department are, and the time commitment that's going to need to be in place with that. But I also think at the same time, we have to recognize that there are different expectations that a lot of the millennials have in terms of work-life balance than the baby boomers had, the Gen Xers had, and whatnot. And while we may be able to bring them a little bit closer to the work ethic that the generations before them had, they're not going to go from where they are now to where a Gen Xer or a baby boomer is. And my clients that have tried to do that have, they struggle with turnover. So then it's about trying to figure out ways where you can they do some of the work that may be required, outside the office? Can they do it from home? Can they do it from, do they have to be in the office to do some of those things? And it's a constant. There's no one conversation that's going to flip the switch and make it okay. It's going to have to be a constant communication about the expectations of the job and what's needed from the company's perspective, and trying to align it with their own career goals and ambitions. If they come to you and they talk about wanting to advance and wanting to do other things, yet they're not willing to put forth the time and the effort, you have to make that correlation with them, and you have to get them to see that during certain points of their life, they're going to have to spend more time and do more things if they want to get to where they want to go, but that doesn't mean it has to be like that all the time. There are certain times in your life when you have younger kids or things like that when you can pull back a little bit and maybe not be as work heavy. But if you are single and you are a little bit younger and you have the time now, take advantage of it and start using it to your benefit, and just helping educate them on how it will be benefit to their long-term career to do that. And again, maybe you can find a mentor or someone out there who is an older millennial that has been able to advance, and get that person to talk to your staff about what they had to do in order to get to where they had to go. Because we all know people who have advanced in their career and have moved on and moved up have done so because they've been willing to sacrifice some things to get there. So if you can find some other people in other departments or within your company or within your tax community that maybe they're viewed as a little bit older, but they're still younger in their career and they've been able to move up, and you can get that person to speak to your person and talk to them a little bit about the benefit of the sacrifice and whatnot. That may also help.
I want to tag one thing onto that. Obviously, what Adam just talked about is, if that person is employed currently and they're having that issue, one of the things that we do with our hiring authorities at the front end prior to taking the search is we really get them to think long and hard about what the work-life balance is going to be. And when we go out and we start our recruiting on it, we are very honest with these candidates about what is expected. I have one company right now that's getting ready to IPO next year, and it will be a 70-hour work week every single week for at least a year. And so if that's not okay for somebody, then it's not the right job. So it's matching those needs and wants. So make sure that you're communicating on the front end. It's in your job description. If you're using your internal HR, you're using recruiters, that you're communicating honestly what the work life is going to be so that they come in with their eyes wide open and there are no surprises.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
All right, we have one last question. What is the time frame once an individual is hired that staff development should begin?
Well, yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
Well, I was going to say immediately. I don't know about you, but certainly you can start that staff development on a short-term basis because you're not going to get to know them very well until they've been there for a little while, but certainly setting up some goals and objectives and things and talking through what they want to do and what they want to learn and setting shorter goals at the beginning, when they can achieve those. I think it starts very, very soon.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say the same thing, Stephanie. I agree it starts immediately. I mean, the reality is we rarely are hiring someone that's a perfect fit for a job. right? There always seems to be something that someone's going to need to work on, whether it's technical, whether it's project management, whether it's cross-functional interface, or whatever the issue is. You're hiring someone because they've checked hopefully 7 or 8 boxes out of the 10 that you'd ideally want in your candidate profile. So from that perspective, I think it's you can start immediately by having the conversations with the person about what they're hired for, where you think they can add immediate value, versus what are the areas that, when you made the decision to hire them, you knew that they were going to have to work on, and start putting a plan in place. I think it's also important to the sooner you can start having the conversations with the person about their career aspirations, the easier it's going to be to have the ongoing questions. I think most of the hiring authorities that I speak to that have the most concern about starting these conversations are the ones that have staff that have been with them for 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 20 years, and now they're just coming to them seemingly out of the blue to want to sit down and talk about their long-term career plan, and they wonder what's the agenda here? Why is this person coming to me and talking about this? So I think if you have a new person, starting to engage them in some of those conversations, or teaching your staff to do this, so that your staff, if you have a manager that had just hired a new staff, teach your manager to sit down with this person and the new person and start to engage them in their career discussions and whatnot, and start putting a plan in place so that that staff's development can start immediately.
All right, thank you, Adam and Stephanie, for your time, and thank you to our attendees for joining us today. Like I said earlier, the session is recorded, so we'll send that to you after this is finished. Also, please feel free to share this with others. If you do have any additional questions that you think of, feel free to email me at shannon@taxtalent.com, and my phone number is also provided if you have any questions. So thanks, everyone, for joining us.